all. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for giving me this task of moderating this session. I hope that this will be the most interesting session in today's among all sessions of today, because here we are going to see the experiences on fever diagnosis and management from two of our great teachers, great professors. So I'll give just a brief introduction. So we know that fever is one of the most common symptoms in clinical practice, and most of the fever are due to infections. And most fever, they resolve either with symptomatic treatment and some fevers even without treatment. However, some fever will require extensive evaluation, for example, PUO, which have been discussed in the previous sessions. And one important point, history and clinical examination, they are of utmost importance in fever evaluation, as this was stressed by Professor Sheila and Professor Radha in the previous sessions. So a good history and clinical examination will help in ordering the appropriate investigations, and this will also help in avoiding unnecessary and invasive tests. And at the same time, accurate identification of the etiology of the fever, specifically etiology of the infection, is also important, because this will prevent us from giving unnecessary antibiotics. This will help in decreasing antimicrobial resistance and help in antimicrobial stewardship. And missed history and examination findings can definitely mislead the diagnosis. So here the speakers have already been invited. We have Professor Muralidharan sir and Professor Sharma sir for this session. So they will be telling their experience in the form of case scenarios. And I would like to make this an interactive session, not like the questions being asked at the last. We can have interaction in between. So the speakers can give questions to the audience in between. Simultaneously, answers can be told. And the audience can also ask some doubts, very relevant doubts in between. However, I would like to complete this session in the stipulated time. So each speaker will be telling for around 15 to 20 minutes. And in the final, we can have a 5 minutes for discussion. So first, I would like to invite Professor M.V. Muralidharan sir for his talk. Welcome, sir.
Dear friends, first of all, I thank Dr. John Jacob, who invited me, and also the organizers of the Pyrexia Conclave for taking part in this function. I am probably not the best person to do the job that is assigned to me, but I took up the challenge because I have been away from acute medicine from 2001. That means 22 years I have not been working in an acute medical ward, mainly seeing my specialty, that is endocrinology. But still, I must accept, because if you want to be a good endocrinologist, you must be a good physician also. So with that in mind, I decided I will take up the challenge. This was probably projected earlier, but I will re-emphasize it once more. The definition of PUO as envisaged by Petersdorf and Beeson in 1961, these are the people who authored the earlier editions of Harrison's textbook of Principles and Practice of Medicine. And I was actually in 1969 learning the 5th edition of that book. Now it is, I think, 21st edition. They have put a definition of a febrile illness which lasts more than 3 weeks, fever 101 or more on 2 occasions at least. There is no certain diagnosis even after 1 week of inpatient evaluation. These are the Petersdorf definition that came. Now, it has changed. The definition itself has changed. They have excluded the immunocompromised peoples from this definition, and hospitalization is also excluded from the definition. You don't have to hospitalize somebody for evaluation of fever. That is how we are. There may be reasons for that, because the type of fever you see in an immunocompromised person are totally different from what happens in an immunocompetent persons. Their natural history is different, manifestations are different, and their progress over also is different. So because of these reasons, it is very worthwhile the immunocompromised are not put into this group, which will create more confusion at the end. And hospitalization in the place where these definitions are coined, like the great United States of America, is a very costly job. Not many people nor the health authorities like to hospitalize a person even for a day. So they do everything fast, they do everything as outpatient and finish. And they can do whatever is being told can also be done without hospitalization. Thorough history taking, physical examination, and almost all the laboratory work, including the scans and procedures like biopsy. All those things can be done by these people. With this introduction, I will go to the case presentation. This is a 40-year-old rubber tapper in the suburbs of Trichur. There is a place called the Chimney Dam. In that area, there are a lot of rubber plantations. This gentleman came with a mild fever with sweats, fatigue, loss of appetite, and weight loss. He was getting treatment in the nearby healthcare facility for some time, but as he was not getting better, they thought they will send him to the Government Medical College, Trichur, where I was working, hoping that I will be able to come to a diagnosis. Examination, a 65 kilogram man, the temperature was 38 to 39 degrees, no pallor, lymphadenopathy or hepatosplenomegaly. His general health was very satisfactory, pulse 90 to 100. He was normotensive, but the food intake was poor. He was not eating well. In the lab evaluation, what could be done in the medical college, his hemoglobin was 10, WBC 4500. You can say that both of them are a little low. And different ESR was 40. Urine examination normal. Peripheral smear, no parasites, but toxic granules could be observed. Vidal was negative. Blood culture done negative. Chest X-ray normal. Abdomen ultrasound showed minimum enlargement of the liver and no other abnormal finding. So what we did, after observing a few days, about 4 or 5 days in the ward, he was reassured and sent home with advice to come after 1 month. He reported for the review. The fever continued as it was, because we could not give him an answer on the first admission. Symptoms also remained the same, but he was more ill than what he was a month ago. He has lost weight still further with minimal pallor. His liver and spleen became palpable. There was no cardiac murmur, urine was normal, and there was no microscopic hematuria. In the new admission we did, echo showed a normal heart function and there was no vegetation. Ultrasound liver and spleen was enlarged, coarse hepatic echoes, no lymph nodes. Blood and urine culture was negative, Mando was negative. Further fall in the hemoglobin, platelets and WC more or less the same, and there were no parasites in the peripheral smear. Because we are not reaching anywhere, we did a bone marrow. There was no immature cells, no malarial parasites, no features of tuberculosis in the bone marrow. Discussion was about doing a liver or spleen biopsy at this point of time. He decided in favor of liver biopsy because risk of spleen puncture or spleen biopsy in our setup was a little higher. So we thought we will play it safe and do a liver biopsy. And we discussed the matter with the patient. You told, many people told, you always discuss with the patient his option. That is exactly what we did. Whether if you want to go for a liver or a spleen biopsy, we are planning for a liver biopsy, what you said? The patient said, I am not in favor of either of these things. And he left the hospital by himself. We call it as a lama, left against medical advice, and went for a home in favor of alternate systems of medicine, who promise to cure many things which we are unable to do it in our practice. After a year, the patient reappeared. He was very much emaciated with significant weight loss, from 65 to 52 kilogram in 15 months. He was looking ill and pale. The spleen increased in size markedly. There was minimal fluid in the abdomen, and liver also enlarged moderately, no lymph node, and normal mental status, no deterioration. Hemoglobin has fallen to 5 gram with 2000 total site, and normal differential ESR has increased from 40 to 75. Peripheral smear, again no. Liver showed some degree of fall in the albumin. The liver transaminases, OT and PT, were moderately enlarged, but INR was preserved, and decided for a liver biopsy. This time he agreed. And this is what we saw in the liver biopsy. You can see I have put a good bold red arrow that was showing the amastigote of visceral leishmaniasis, Leishmania donovani, in the liver biopsy specimen. The interest in this case, Kerala is not a known area endemic for leishmaniasis. We never thought of this possibility. In fact, that area we should be able to. And we did not go in favor of more aggressive, and also at that time, many of the newer techniques of diagnosis were not available at that time. I am telling you this story of a patient almost 30 years ago, 1993. So we didn't have many of the things which are available then. So the diagnosis is Kala-Azar. From a non-endemic area, we take 18 months for the diagnosis. Of course, repeated history, repeated physical examination. This is what I used to tell my colleagues, that you do it every day. A person will take a new set of history and physical examination every day. Today house surgeon will do, next day the junior tutor will do, third day assistant professor, one day I myself will do. Like that we were doing it almost every day, history and physical examination. And still it took 18 months, and he was treated with a neostibogluconate, and the person recovered with regression of signs and symptoms. See the picture, the epidemiological picture. Leishmaniasis in India is predominantly something which happens in the eastern coast of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. Kerala is not one of the marked endemic area of leishmaniasis. The reason, so if he has come now to the hospital, say after 30 years, things are quite different. You do a PCR, don't bother about liver and spleen biopsy which will frighten the patient. You do the PCR for the Leishmania antigen, send the fingerprint blood, or you can even take in a blotting paper and send it to any lab which will do the PCR, and you will get the diagnosis faster. It is non-invasive, and we have got safer medications today, not sodium stibogluconate, as the antimonials, which are nephrotoxic and also hepatotoxic. Now we have got liposomal amphotericin B, 25 milligram per kilogram body weight for 5 days, but we have to use a more toxic drug. So when this was the state of affairs, we kept communicate with the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine to inspect the area from where the person came. And with a lot of search, they did a survey for hepatosplenomegaly and also possible other members who may be having the thing. We could pick up one more case of leishmaniasis in that survey, and we could find that the sandfly, Phlebotomus argentipus, which is the vector for Kala-Azar, was present in this area. So your diagnosis doesn't stop with the diagnosing and treating. You have to even go back to the field and see how it came, where it came, and why it came. So think, even if something is not very common in an area, still you can think of these possibilities, like leishmaniasis, especially somebody has got a hepatosplenomegaly. This is what we did. This was the first case. Now we will go to the second case.
Sir, I would like to interrupt in between. No, so that was a very enlightening case, because this case, sir was telling, it was 30 years back. So now we know that the epidemiology of Kala-Azar has changed a lot. Kerala has become an endemic area, especially areas like Nilambur. Sir was telling it was related to the Ghats. And also, so now when a patient with similar symptoms like a prolonged fever with hepatosplenomegaly come to us, definitely we will keep Kala-Azar as a differential diagnosis, and we would evaluate for that. And also, as sir told, like at that time the only option available was a biopsy, a bone marrow biopsy, and if it was not possible, to do a splenic or a liver biopsy. So when you consider the biopsies, the maximum sensitivity in Kala-Azar for any of the biopsies is splenic biopsy, that is 90%, whereas bone marrow biopsy, the sensitivity is around 60%, and liver biopsy somewhere in between these two. Now we have other tests, non-invasive tests like the RK39 antigen test, which has got good sensitivity and specificity for leishmaniasis. But the only problem is that this test, it can remain positive for a long time, like 2 to 3 years, even after treatment. So for a recurrent leishmaniasis, it is not possible to use this test. And also HIV is a very important consideration. Sir, was HIV testing? It was 30 years, 95. Okay. So now, like,
major affair. Of course, HIV was looked into.
So checking HIV status is also a very important aspect in any patient who is diagnosed to have a visceral leishmaniasis. And also regarding treatment, so previously, so that was the only available drug at that time, the antimonial, so the stibogluconate. But now the organisms in most of the areas have become resistant to this antimonials, like they have started showing treatment failure. So currently the drug of choice is amphotericin B. We have different regimens for HIV negative and HIV positive. And also we have an oral drug, miltefosine. It is very difficult to procure, but that is also shown to be a promising drug. So back to sir for the next case.
The next one was a 40-year-old tailor with 1 month history of fever. He is a diabetic on treatment with a reasonable glycemic control. Developed mild fever 99 to 101, mostly in the evening, except sweats, no other associated symptom to any system there, and no abnormal finding except fever on systemic examination. Blood count, a normal hemoglobin and total differential count, but TSR was moderately elevated. The fasting and postprandial blood sugar, we found that it was out of control, both fasting and postprandial, normal renal and liver function, normal chest X-ray. So we stepped up the anti-diabetic medication to achieve the diabetic control, and he was discharged after 1 week in the hospital. Of course, fever continued, no diagnosis was achieved at that time. He was readmission after 6 months. He came back again, that fever is still continuing. Mild fever on most of the days, no new points in the history or physical examination. Lab data showed some improvement in the diabetic control. He was discharged again home with advice to follow up monthly. He had 6 monthly follow-up every month, where all these things were repeated and no new information was there. After 1 year, fever continued, but a new history point came. He was having pain of the right heel on walking. And on examination, there was minimal swelling of the ankle with tenderness over the calcaneum. With that, lab investigation ESR has gone up to 100 millimeter, which was only 60 earlier, and X-ray angle showed there was a lesion, shown the red arrow, that is area of the bone has been gone from this person in the calcaneum, and we did a biopsy of that area, found that area of caseation necrosis with Langerhans cell. The tuberculosis of the bone presenting with absolutely no local symptom, and actually we took this case to UK. When I went to UK in 1980, discussed with my boss, there is a patient like this. Then he said, search the literature. Had to be a good library. And bone tuberculosis, calcaneus is an unusual site. Why it got localized, this thing? And the reason my consultant told me at that time is trauma related localization of tuberculosis. This man's job was a tailor, repeatedly using his foot for operating the sewing machine. That is the reason why the patient had localization onto the calcaneum. And fever subsided on anti-tubercular adjustment. I was fortunate to publish this in British Journal of Infection in 1981. This article was published, this thing. So that is the second case that I thought I will present. You want to add anything?
Yes, that was also a very interesting case, sir. So bone tuberculosis is as such less common among extrapulmonary tuberculosis, and whenever we hear of bone tuberculosis, we'll think about the port spine, which is the most common among them. But this calcaneum, that was a very unusual site for bone tuberculosis. And we know that TB is something which we should consider in any cause of PUO, because like we know that we are the capital of tuberculosis. So one additional point which I would like to add is the problem with the treatment of bone tuberculosis. Like other extrapulmonary TB, like TB meningitis. So this bone tuberculosis is something very difficult to treat. The optimal duration of ATT is actually not defined. So the guidelines, the Indian guidelines, they tell to extend the continuation phase by a few months. But we often see that we'll have to treat this for a long time, not just, anyway 6 months is not enough. We find like it will take time to resolve, 12 months, 18 months, etc. And this is very true in case of port spine. And also there are concerns regarding the penetration of the anti-tubercular drugs into the bone. We don't have enough studies to know which all the drugs penetrate well, which all do not. So that is also a problem. So these are some reasons why you have to prolong the treatment in bone and joint tuberculosis. So I hand over to sir for the next case.
In fact, I give anti-tubercular treatment for 18 to 24 months. That is the standard I follow for the tuberculosis. Of course, I did not do tuberculin test in this patient, but getting a positive tuberculin test in our population, who all had BCG on the third day of life in our country, it is not going to add anything unless you get a very hyperreactive manto, which may probably say that there is some acute tuberculosis event that is going on. Doing a manto is probably not going to be of help in a patient like this. That's why probably I did not do that. We will go to the third case. This is a 60-year-old male, retired from Indian Army 20 years before presentation, sometime in the 1973 or 74. And he presented with fever with chills and rigors and sweating. Fatigue, malaise, myalgia, arthralgia, palpitation and dyspnea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain and diarrhea. Whole set of symptoms was present. Physical examination showed anemia, fever and a just palpable liver and spleen. That is the only abnormality. Investigation, a low hemoglobin, white cell count is low, normal platelet, blood smear, no parasite was noted, urine normal, chest X-ray normal, LFT, RFT normal except for minimal rise in the globulins. Urine examination showed traces of albumin and treated empirically 4 or 5 days with the antipyretics. No diagnosis was achieved, just reassured like what I have did with the previous 2 cases, because this is the limit to which we can go at that time. After 1 month, he got readmitted with the same group of symptoms, low hemoglobin, LFTs showed a mild increase in the bilirubin, 2.5, which was normal earlier. Transaminase, alkaline phosphatase were normal, but the peripheral smear at that time showed Plasmodium, malaria species. Something very unusual in our setup. This is not something which is very common in Kerala. Most of the cases I have seen during my training period as well as working in Kerala for a number of years. Malaria, probably the only case I have seen is this patient. I have not seen much. Not something very common. We could see that Sison could be seen. We can show a band form. Unfortunately, we could not see any gametocyte in this person. I got a picture from somewhere else. I think the classical gametocyte of Plasmodium malariae. That also I got. This is not for this patient. This I got it just for telling you what are the things that you can see in a patient with a malaria infection. Again, going back to the history. History doesn't stop with a diagnosis. I wanted to find out why this man developed. So on asking him, I told earlier he was a soldier working for the Indian Army. And during his service, worked in Meghalaya during the Indo-Pak War, 1971 war, when Bangladesh was liberated. He was working or posted in Meghalaya. That is one of the areas where Plasmodium malariae is there. Probably he had the infection at that time. Maybe symptomatic or partly treated, whatever it is, it's remaining. One of the areas, Plasmodium malariae can remain dormant in the tissues for months, years, or even decades without showing it up. And he developed the clinical signs after 20 years after the primary infection. He got it in 1970, before 1971. That is how we got it in this person. And this is a picture of Meghalaya. That is the place where the Indo-Pakistan war took place, is the border, Meghalaya. So the 3 cases, the take-home messages would be a correct and frequent recording of temperature. I would prefer oral or rectal thermometers. Children, rectal; adults, oral. I have less faith in the other types of thermometer, including the infrared, which is usually just shown in the airport. At that time, those things were not available also. That is the one. Secondly, the history should be repeated many times. Sometimes even after diagnosis is reached. That's what I did and found out he is living in Meghalaya many years ago. Repeated physical examination is needed when you have a PUO where you don't have an answer. Each time a new finding may appear. This person, it happened to me after 3 months. Patient came for review, the parasite was positive in this person. And when the diagnosis is not arrived, perseverance. Do it again. That is the answer to the problem. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you, sir. So that was also a wonderful case, Plasmodium malariae, which is a very rare species in India. So this scenario characteristically describes the recrudescence, which is described in Plasmodium malaria, that is persistence for a long time. And one more point which I noted was that albuminuria. So, sir, can that be due to the cotton malarial nephropathy which we described?
Nephropathy is described in albuminuria. To have nephrotic syndrome. That is one of the presentation. But the albumin in this patient did not satisfy the nephrotic syndrome criteria. It has to be a minimum 3 grams of albumin per this thing. It was traces of albumin. That is why we didn't persist with it.
So it is postulated that this chronic Plasmodium malaria infection will induce an inflammatory reaction and immune complex deposition in the kidneys, the renal tubules, which ultimately results in the nephrotic syndrome-like picture. So thank you, sir, for those wonderful cases.